Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our afternoon series of Conservationists in Action. We talk to authors, scientists, and others who are working in the field of conservation. And today we have a twofer. We have a scientist and an author. We're very fortunate to have Anders Halverson here this afternoon, so welcome, Anders.
Thank you, Mark.
Glad to finally get you out to NCTC after way too long. And let me give you a little background on Anders, and then we'll hear a little about his new book. Anders is an award-winning writer with a PhD in aquatic ecology from Yale University. He wrote his book as a research associate at the University of Colorado Center for the American West with a grant from the National Science Foundation. The book we're going to talk about today, his most recent book, is this fascinating book with a great picture of a trout on the cover. It's called An Entirely Synthetic Fish, How Rainbow Trout Beguiled America and Overran the World. So nothing like a modest title to describe a little game fish here. And Anders, before we talk in detail about the book, you do have an interesting background, and this book kind of reflects it. Tell us a little about your training.
Sure, I'll just launch right in here. I got my PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, and a lot of what I was working on was, or some of the tools I was using was sequencing DNA to look at amphibians, the ecology and conservation of amphibians. And one of the things that really got me going on this book is while I was sitting there pipetting away and pouring gels, I kept thinking about the way science was actually used in these policy debates that you see, whether it's in the press or whether you're involved with them yourselves. And so often it seemed to me that the science was being used to justify people's positions that they'd arrived at based on some much deeper set of values.
Yeah.
And I wanted to sort of explore that. You know, I was producing this science and wondering how that was going to be used. And I really wanted to explore that more in depth. And so when I finished my PhD, I got a grant from the National Science Foundation to go work with a historian at the University of Colorado to study, in this case, fisheries management and the controversies that we have today and what their origins are and the deep set of values that go into that sort of culturally and at an individual level.
Who was the historian you worked with?
Patricia Nelson Limerick.
That's who I was guessing.
Right.
Yeah, she's been a long-time environmental historian.
That's right.
And superb.
That's right.
And the result is this book.
book.
You brought in a presentation. I think we'll switch to that. And I'd just like to let folks know, especially those of you who are tuning in from the Fish and Wildlife Service, at least the early stages of this story involve the Bureau of Fisheries, which is the earliest predecessor for us. And one of the things I really love about your book, and we'll see it, is it goes back to the origins of American conservation. George Perkins Marsh, these old folks. Fish came first
That's
in the
right.
eyes of our
They
conservation. So tell us a little about the book.
Great. So there's a picture of the cover of the book. So I'll tell you a little bit. I told you one half of the reason I got writing this book, and the other half of the reason is I grew up in Colorado fishing. And at some point I just stopped fishing, at some point in my teenage years. And I never really thought about why I had stopped fishing. Really probably until I was sitting there pipetting away again. And it occurred to me that there really is this fundamental paradox involved in recreational fishing, in my case fly fishing. I see it and saw it as a way to escape civilization, a way to escape industrialization, a way to reconnect with the natural world. And yet so much of our fish that are out there that we're fishing for are very much a product of industrialization and civilization. And so I started thinking about that and looking into that, and I came across these examples here. So on the top left, that's the world record, or was the world record rainbow trout, which is a triploid. It's a fish that was caught up in Lake Diffenbacher in Alberta by a couple of brothers who stocked it forever. Then on the bottom, you have a genetically modified trout. So they've knocked out myostatin, so it just keeps producing protein, and you can see it's got six-pack abs.
Yeah.
Fish are not supposed to have six-pack abs. And then on the right side is a picture of a group at the University of Missouri that were feeding their fish creatine, which is the same bodybuilding supplement that Mark McGwire used in the home run derby. And they state literally in the press release that their goal was to They thought fishermen would pay more to capture fish, harder fighting fish. So there was going to be a super fish out there for you to go catch. And I stumbled across an article in the Wall Street Journal from 1996 about Idaho. They were stocking these fish, and they found the fish weren't doing their job. They weren't actually taking the hook. And so they decided they needed to actually teach them to eat worms before they put them out there. So they were so used to pellets that they weren't touching the worms that people were putting out there. So you keep running across these stories. But those are sort of extreme examples, right? But even going here, so rainbow trout are the most commonly stocked fish in the United States. And actually it was hard to get this information since I know we're going out to a lot of state and federal agencies. There's not a consolidated database that shows us what's been stocked where. So I had to go to every state agency, and of course all the data was in all of these different formats, and try to consolidate it all. And once I pulled all that data together, you can see the results. The bar on the far left is the number of the pounds of rainbow trout that are stocked every year in the United States by the state and federal agencies. So it goes rainbow trout, and then it's brown trout, brook trout, and then catfish, and the rest are almost non-existent in terms of weight. We actually stock quite a few walleye, for example, but at a very small size. So rainbow trout are far and away the fish that's stocked in the United States. And as people may or may not know, they're native only to the Pacific Rim, from really from California up around through Alaska and all the way over to Kamchatka. But they've been introduced to every state in the United States, every continent except Antarctica. And there's famous fisheries. They're not just there physically, they are a cultural icon throughout the world. In fact, they were our state fish in Colorado up until 1994, and I think the state fish in Utah until 1997. Not native to either place.
Nope.
I've got a picture here of some postage stamps from around the world. New Zealand, Malawi, the bottom is Oman, and on the right is South Africa. So, like I'm saying, they're a cultural worldwide icon, this fish, and yet I think so many people sort of take them for granted and don't really think about this fish. I know that was the case for me. I was catching rainbow trout as a kid. I remember learning our state emblems for Colorado, and it was the blue spruce and the rainbow trout, and I never really thought twice about it until I started working on this. And what I stumbled across when I really started investigating it was some really great stories. And so that's what the book is really about. So you mentioned the sort of origins of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's what I'll get into now. So in the 19th century, the United States was undergoing this industrial revolution that was unlike anything we'd seen before. And at least for the purposes of this story, there were two significant components. First of all, it decimated the fisheries up and down, especially up and down the East Coast. We had the rivers being used as sewers. We had a lot of dams being built. We had intensive agriculture going on and a lot of logging going on. And it really destroyed the fisheries up and down the East Coast. And second of all, it created it brought people in from the country. It created urbanization. So it brought people out of the countryside and into the cities, created a tremendous amount of wealth for the people who were running the show at the time, the Anglo-Saxons. And they became very concerned about their offspring, who were spending, in their opinion, way too much time not working, sitting around indoors. And I'm going to read a quote to you from Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was who is or was the father of the famous Supreme Court justice, and was a famous columnist himself at the time. And he said, "Such a set of black-coated, stiff-jointed, soft-muscled, paste-complexioned youth as we can boast in our Atlantic cities never before sprang from the loins of Anglo-Saxon lineage." And that was, Teddy Roosevelt famously, I actually really enjoy that quote because I have kids myself. And of course, we're worried about the same thing today.
Nature deficit disorder and so on. Yeah.
Richard Liv and nature deficit disorder. So it always gives me some comfort to know that they were worried about exactly the same thing 150 years ago. And he wasn't the only one. Teddy Roosevelt famously warns about this. And so what are we going to do about this problem? The state of Vermont asks George Perkins Marsh to write a report for them in 1857 about their fisheries. And George Perkins Marsh is a fascinating character in his own right. He's considered by many to be one of the founders of the conservation movement in the United States. But he wrote a biography of the camel. He wrote the first Icelandic English dictionary. He was Lincoln's ambassador to Rome. I mean, he was an incredible person. And he writes this report for the state of Vermont about their fisheries. And just to show you that I wasn't cherry picking that quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., I'll read you a quote from his report to Vermont. He writes in this report about fisheries, "We have become not merely a more thoughtful and earnest, but it is to be feared a duller as well as a more effeminate and less bold and spirited nation." And so what are we going to do about this? Right. Well, obviously, we're going to get people out fishing again, right? That'll turn the boys into manly men. And, as he writes, democracy itself will be, that's the only way to save democracy is to have virile men again. But there's no fish out there. So he points to the fact that we had just discovered about 15 years earlier in France how to artificially propagate fish. Right. That's the answer. So we'll artificially propagate these fish, stock them into these rivers, and the kids will go fishing again, and democracy is safe. And the story just sort of goes on from there. So there's a hiatus. He urges the states to take this up. There's a hiatus for the Civil War, and after the Civil War, it comes roaring back with a vengeance, thanks in large part to Spencer Fullerton Baird, who's on the top right of the screen. And he was the assistant head of the Smithsonian at the time. And this was a time when the federal government didn't fund science. Mm-hmm. Mostly almost the only science they funded was exploration and mapping. Otherwise, there was no National Science Foundation out there. But somehow he convinced, not only was he a great naturalist, but he was very politically savvy. Yeah. And he convinced Congress to put up some money to establish a 1-year U.S. Fish Commission. And actually, just because I'm speaking to you and you work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the congressmen warned at the time, he voted against this creation of the Fish Commission. There will be no end to the expenditures of public money before we get through with it, he warned. But nevertheless,
more than 100 years later, he's
exactly.
Right. We're still going on.
And somehow Baird got past him, overrode him. They established, but it's just going to be a 1-year temporary thing to investigate the decline of the scup in New England. So Baird does this investigation, determines that the fish traps that they have in the estuaries are wrecking the spawning, and that there's going to be no more scup if they don't start opening up the fish traps at least a few days a week. And he even threatens Massachusetts and Rhode Island that if they don't mandate this, the federal government will step in and will mandate it. Well, it's a complete disaster because, first of all, there's a scup baby boom the following year, so he's sort of discredited on the scientific front. And second of all, Massachusetts and Rhode Island call his bluff and say, come on, the federal government is never going to step in and force us to do this. And of course, they were right. The federal government wasn't going to do that. So he's sort of at loose ends. And the American Fish Culturalists Association, which is now the American Fisheries Society, goes to him and they say they've started a few years earlier basically to produce, artificially propagate trout for market. So they would propagate them and send them to New York and Boston and sell them to the restaurants there. And they convince him that what he needs to do is take on fish propagation. Mm-hmm. And that, once again, being politically savvy, he says, great idea. Well, he says, sure, if you can get the funding, I'll take it on. So Robert Roosevelt, who is Teddy's uncle, who was a Congress member at the time, does it, pushes through a bill to get the federal government to get involved with artificially propagating fish. And the rest is history, as they say. So very quickly, artificially propagating fish becomes the focus of the U.S. Fish Commission. There is still some scientific investigation that goes on, but most of its budget is going to fish propagation. And it becomes a very big deal. So the picture on the left there is one of my favorite pictures. Yeah. That's the unfinished Washington Monument rising up out of the mall there. And there's a horse-drawn cart full of milk cans which contain fish fry. And they're bringing them, actually, if you look at a map, the Washington Monument is a little bit off-center. And the reason is there was a pond right there on the mall which became the first pond for the Fish Commission to raise fish. And so they started this big operation. And on the right side is Central Station, which was right there next to the mall as well. And those are egg hatching jars in the background. And they started a big operation of raising fish and shipping them out all over the country. And they had these specially designed fish cars, and the railroads were happy to provide free transportation because they were eager to get people using their trains for personal transportation. They
Sure.
wanted to haul people as well as cargo, right? So they were happy to provide free transportation because they knew these fish were going to be stocked in the rivers along their route. In fact, some of the trains even developed their own fish hatcheries just for this purpose. And they would ship these fish out and stock them on the way. And the way you would do it is you would, because he was politically savvy, he would give fish, the Fish Commission would give fish to anybody or any group. But the only catch was you have to write your Congress member to ask them. So that way the Congress member was vitally aware of how important the Fish Commission was to his or her constituents. So you would write them and say, I would like some fish for my lake. And they would say, sure. And they would send you a telegram a few days ahead of time, and you would wait at the station, and the train would pull in. They'd pour some fish into your milk can, and you would go take them out and stock them wherever it was. And I like to read this quote too because I have nothing but respect for Baird, but he was very politically savvy, like I say. And in one of his letters that's at the National Archives here actually it's up in Maryland, he wrote to one of his subordinates. One of his subordinates had complained that these fish aren't going to survive. You know they're not going to survive where these people are putting them. And he wrote, it does not make much difference what Rockwood does with the salmon eggs. The object is to introduce them into as many different states as possible and to have credit with Congress accordingly. If they are there, they are there. We can so swear, and that is the end of it. So they were willing to ship these things all over. And it wasn't just, there was another big movement that really was being pushed at this time, which was the acclimatization movement. Yeah. And that term has taken on somewhat of a different connotation today. It's, you hear it for people climbing mountains and going to different altitudes.
True.
But at the time, what it referred to was there was a big movement to transport wild species all over the world. The English were transporting them all throughout their empire. The French were doing the same thing. And we had the same idea here, to transport these wild species and try to, in many cases, remake a place in the ways of the old world that we recognized. So we had in the United States, for example, a number of different acclimatizing societies. The reason we have starlings here in the United States today is because there was a sort of captain of industry who had been a pharmacist in New York City, and he concluded that Americans were going to be culturally impoverished if we didn't have all the birds that are mentioned in Shakespeare. So starlings are mentioned in a line in Henry IV, I believe, unless it's Henry V. And therefore, he imported some starlings, let them go in Central Park, and again,
the rest is history.
The rest is history. So the same thing was going on with fish. And during my research, I came across any number of letters in these magazines, the fish and the fishing journals of the day, about it's the age of social Darwinism also. Let the best fish, like the best man, win. Mm-hmm. So that's what they were thinking of. Let's just ship these trout around the world and around the country for sure and see who wins. Okay, so this guy Livingstone Stone, he was a minister. He was an interesting character, and I became sort of obsessed, sort of pursuing him when I was working on this book.
And his narrative threads through the early part of the book.
It does. And he's a fascinating character because he was this minister in New Hampshire, Charlestown, New Hampshire, not too far from Boston, and he traced his family lineage all the way back to the Mayflower. And somehow he got interested in fish culture in the early days of it. And at some point decided to chuck being a minister, that is, and devote himself to fish culture. And he starts, and you can still see the remains of his ponds if you go visit Charlestown. And he goes down to talk to Baird, being influential in the movement at the time in the American Fish Culturalists Association. He goes down to visit Baird, and one of the fish, of course, that they really want to recover are salmon on the East Coast. And because salmon have been wiped out. One thought would have been to go to Canada and get some salmon, but the U.S.-Canadian relations were at a low ebb at that point, so that wasn't really a possibility. So he says, let's go to California and get some of those salmon and bring them out to the East Coast. And this is in 1872, 3 years after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Baird, of course, says, okay, he buys into this, and he sends Livingstone Stone and a couple of assistants, and they take the train across the country. Must have been an incredible time to travel on that train. I mean, and if you look at these trains of the day, I mean, they were small compared to the diesel trains we have today. So you picture this guy traveling across the country on this train, and he gets to Sacramento, and he gets off the train, and he says, so I'm here to get some Pacific salmon to ship back to the East. And they all say, well, there's no Pacific salmon left out here. And he says, what? And they have, the hydraulic mining has been so intense in California that the bed of the Sacramento River was going up by 6 feet per year at one point. So of course that doesn't do the spawning beds any good. So he starts asking around, and finally he runs across a railroad engineer who says, yeah, I think the Indians still spear salmon way up north on this river called the McCloud. So he sets out for the McCloud. And this is this minister who's never been out of New Hampshire or Massachusetts before. He heads up, takes the train as far north as he can to where they're still laying track, gets off, gets on the stagecoach, goes as far as he can, gets off and starts walking. And sure enough, he starts walking up the McCloud, and he and his two assistants see salmon drying on the bushes. And the Wintu Indians are there, and that is their fish catching ground. Now the reason the fish have survived there is one, because they haven't discovered gold there, but two, because the Wintu have killed or driven off every settler who has tried to come to the McCloud. And somehow, this Livingstone Stone convinces them to let him stay. And there are some threatening moments. He risks his life to do this. Somehow he convinces them to let him stay and build a fish hatchery. And he starts shipping fish back east. And for 7 years, he ships Pacific salmon back east. And not then and not to this day do we have a run of Pacific salmon on the East Coast. It was a failure. But they started hearing about this fish called the rainbow trout that another famous fish culturist, Seth Green, was experimenting with. He had shipped brook trout from New York to California to the California's acclimatizing society called the Ornithological and Piscatorial Acclimatizing Society of California.
There's a mouthful.
Yeah. And they in return had shipped off this trout that they'd found swimming in their ponds, and he actually thought they were pretty good fish. So Baird and Stone decided to try experimenting with those. And Baird goes a few miles upstream and starts a rainbow trout hatchery, starts shipping these fish back. And within a few years, they become the fish. They're in 33 of 38 states then in the nation. And they take off because they're easy to raise in hatcheries. They're very hardy, so they can withstand conditions that the brook trout can't withstand. And they're good fighting fish. And remember, our goal here is to create manly men,
Virile
right?
man, yeah.
So we need a good fighting fish on the other end of the line. So within a few years, these become the sport fish. And it just goes on from there. This is a picture of the rainbow trout hatchery there. And now I'm going to skip forward. So now let's flash forward about 70 or 80 years because it just keeps getting more and more intense. Actually,
Yes.
before I skip to that, no, I'll skip.
Well,
that.
the hatchery lasts a long time too, doesn't it?
The hatchery
Baird
does.
station
It's
there?
now unfortunately underwater. I went out there trying to see it, and unfortunately it was
Would they put a dam
underwater.
up or something?
Yep,
Is
yep. So it's under Lake Shasta. So you can't. It's 200 or 300 feet too. You can't even scuba
can't
dive if
dive.
you want to see it.
I just like how it was pure serendipity that they switched to rainbow trout. I mean, obviously, eventually they would have found it. And you noted Seth Green, which I'd never heard before, had actually
he was
been looking at this
experimenting
for a
with them as
while.
well.
But I mean, that's great.
Yeah, and it just and as you know, they've taken over and still are the fish.
I've caught them in 2 states in Australia and all over New Zealand.
That's right.
It never occurred to me that they
Well,
Should have. There's no native trout probably in New
There's-
Zealand
right.
or Australia.
and
but-
they're a big problem, and South Africa as well.
yeah.
And there's a big controversy right now in Australia because there are some people who want to get rid of them, and some people because the galaxids are the native fish there that are in
Yes.
trouble because of it. In South Africa, there was a push to remove them, but another big group of supporters wanted to declare rainbow trout an honorary indigenous fish so that it was native under the law in South Africa. And of course, you've got these huge fisheries in South America, Argentina,
Yeah, and
Chile.
then, like New Zealand, I mean, the whole South Island, a big part of their economy was built
Right.
on fly fishing, and you know, and it was weird. They seemed to prioritize, you know, well, maybe browns are better than rainbow, but they're all invasive. So
Right.
nothing that was particularly indigenous.
Right, it is fascinating. The debates that go
I
on about
know.
which is the better and which should be allowed to remain. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, this leads us right into the
Amazing segment.
story of Green River.
So in 1962, we, the citizens of the United States, decided to poison all the fish in basically the southwest quarter. It's not quite a quarter, but the southwest corner of Wyoming, a watershed that's 15,000 square miles. That's the size of Connecticut and Massachusetts combined. So that we could introduce rainbow trout. Now, I want to emphasize right away that the reason they got this idea was because they were building some dams. The Bureau of Reclamation was going to build a dam at Fontenelle, which is up, you can see the Wind Rivers as a little white slash there, just below there, and then down at Flaming Gorge, which is in Utah. And these dams were going to fundamentally change that river. It was traditionally a traditional western river that flooded in the spring and then got down to a warm little trickle in the late summer and was always full of sediment and shifting around. And it was going to change that to a consistent flow, cold water river. And so their position was this is going to create an ideal situation to create this fishery. And there's some debate about how much they were thinking about the native fish when they decided to poison them out. But in any case, there are people who still support this operation today, say it was the right thing to do at the time because they knew that the native fish, the humpback chub, the suckers, the Colorado pike minnow, weren't going to make it. Though all the letters in the archives that I read, it looks to me like it wasn't on their mind. Mm-hmm. Native fish were not, they did not think in terms of natives versus non-natives. That seems, to me anyway, that's just a paradigm that I take for granted, or did until I started on this book. But in 1962, they did not think in those terms. They thought in terms of game fish and trash fish, and that was it. And you talk to some of the old fish and game managers, and they agree that they considered their job was to, pretty much to establish rainbow trout wherever they could. So they didn't think in those terms, except for a very few people. This is one of them, Robert Miller, who was an ichthyologist, and he was one of the first people to study native fish. I think he and his father-in-law / PhD advisor, think about that complicated relationship for a minute.
It boggles the mind.
Were the two, Carl Hubbs was the name of his father-in-law. They were the first two people, I think, to publish even a paper about native fish in the Transactions of the American Fisheries Society. So they Miller went all out trying to block this thing. And he was a very sort of quiet person. He didn't enjoy, public speaking. I think he might have had a stutter or something and was sort of shy around the public, as opposed to his father-in-law, Carl Hubbs, who was sort of this bulldozer, A-type, gregarious personality. But somehow the two of them had this fantastically productive relationship. And Miller, he might have been shy about people, but he was driven. And he tried to stop this thing. And he went to the Sierra Club. He went to the Ecological Society of America. He tried to get, he went to the newspapers, tried to get people to oppose this project. And he couldn't get any traction whatsoever. And he complains in one of his letters, Americans have been brainwashed by this culture that prizes game fish over coarse fish. And indeed, this operation was known as the Green River Rehabilitation. And if you read the letters, it's about the fear is of recontamination by native species.
Yeah.
Once they've gotten rid of them, they don't want to be recontaminated by these darn native species. Once again, since this is a Fish and Wildlife Service operation, I'm going to read you a quote from the Fish and Wildlife Service press release at the day, who declared in their press release about this operation, biologists regard aquatic habitats as pastures in which the end products are fishes which can be taken by man by sporting means and which also serve him as food. If the aquatic pastures are inhabited by species which compete directly with sport fishes, little improvement can be expected by stocking with hatchery fish. It is considered, note the passive voice here, it is considered good management to remove the existing fishes and to restock preferred species. So that was the mentality at the time.
Yeah.
And the Fish and Wildlife Service provided the funding for this operation, and the state agencies of Wyoming and Utah were also involved. So Miller gets absolutely no traction. The operation goes ahead as planned. And the poison they used was rotenone, and it kills everything with gills. So it kills fish and aquatic invertebrates. And on the picture on the top left there, you can see the white. They set up these drip lines every 10 miles along the Green River. And the rotenone turns the water white, so you can see the white dripping into the stream there. And what they did is they did it sequentially. So once the rotenone front from the uppermost drip line reached your drip line, you would turn on the spigot. And so this rotenone front pushed downstream, and apparently it was just an amazing sight, these thousands of fish thrashing in front of this rotenone front trying to escape this thing. And it was an amazing sight and a complete success in their mind. They absolutely wiped out all of the, or almost all of the fish. It was a military scale operation. They had airboats buzzing around, helicopters flying over to get any sloughs that were off the main channel. And interestingly, the picture on the bottom right is a guy who's gone out to collect a fish. So they urged people to come out and pick up the poisoned fish and bring them home for dinner. They said there's going to be lots of fish sitting around. So people went out and picked up these fish that had been poisoned by rotenone and brought them home to eat, which of course is fascinating today and controversial today because rotenone is now used. This is a very controversial topic, but there are some people who absolutely oppose the use of rotenone anymore because it's now used in laboratories to induce Parkinson's disease symptoms in mice. So we'll get onto that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's sort of a fascinating issue. Okay, so the operation is a complete success. They wipe out all the fish in the Green River. And they had planned to do this operation as soon as Bureau Rec closed the dam at Flaming Gorge. And that way the poison would build up behind the dam and naturally detoxify because of sunlight. But Bureau Rec delayed closing the dam for some reason, I don't know why, until November. And at that point, the water would have been too cold for the rotenone to be effective. So they decided to go ahead with the operation as planned, but detoxify it by spreading potassium permanganate into the river off a bridge. And they picked this bridge here in Browns Park in Colorado. And so what they do is they set up these drums with, or what they did, set up these drums with potassium permanganate. And as soon as the rotenone front reached them, they started spreading it. Well, it was a complete disaster. So there was a cold front that comes through, so it's whipping wind and snow all over the place. And this is a 3-day operation, so they have to be spreading this stuff for 3 days now. The way they determine how toxic the water is below the bridge is they have these sentinel cages with a fish inside it, right? So you can imagine some guy in the middle of the night trying to look in this sentinel cage to see how well the fish is doing and then radio up to the bridge and say, more potassium permanganate. I wasn't there. I don't know exactly how it happened, but tough conditions.
Yeah.
And needless to say, some of this rotenone gets downstream. They don't have enough potassium permanganate. It's the wrong consistency for the spreaders. It's just, so rotenone gets downstream. And 16 miles downstream from this bridge is Dinosaur National Monument. Dinosaur is a big deal because just a few years earlier, Brower and the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society and those guys had fought to try to save Dinosaur from another dam that Bureau of Reclamation wanted to build. And they waged this public relations campaign in the newspapers to convince Americans that our national parks were our national heritage. They were our cathedrals, right? And Americans bought into this, and they succeeded, and they blocked this. And so they just convinced Americans that dinosaur was not only were national parks sacred, but dinosaur in particular was sacred. And second of all, this occurred almost to the day, within a couple of weeks of Rachel Carson's publication of Silent Spring. And that was a huge deal that I think it's hard to overstate. I think we don't quite recognize it today, but that book transfixed the country. And it was about chemicals in our environment. And so here is this 1-2 punch. We now all of a sudden we have dead fish who have been poisoned washing up within our national parks. And all of a sudden it becomes a big controversy. Now, whether the dead fish were actually poisoned in the park or not is unclear. Probably at least some of them were poisoned upstream and were just washed downstream. Moot point, doesn't matter, because all of a sudden it's controversy and, it becomes a big deal. People are writing letters to Congress. Congress is asking Stuart Udall, who is Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior, new Secretary of the Interior, what's going on here? He has Park Service butting heads with Fish and Wildlife Service in the Interior Department over this operation. So he commissions a review in which he writes and signs this review that says, from now on, whenever a native species is imperiled by one of these projects, that needs to be one of the top priorities in evaluating whether the project should go forward. And those are big words in those days. It seems relatively normal today, but those were new. It was a new idea. He sets up a committee on rare and endangered wildlife species in 1963. This is about 6 months after this operation. Interestingly, he puts the same guy in charge of that committee who was in charge of the Green River operation. And that committee starts coming up with a list. Actually, Miller is one of the advisors for the list of fish, endangered fish. They put together this list of endangered species, and that committee leads directly to Congress passing the early, there were 2 early iterations of the Endangered Species Act in 63 and 66. That committee's work led directly to those iterations and ultimately to the 1973 Endangered Species Act, which is the one that's really enforced today, right? So it was really, in many ways, I won't say the Endangered Species Act came directly out of this Green River operation, but it was certainly one of the main tributaries that fed into the movement that led to the Endangered Species Act. So now, just to show you that things go full circle, we've now spent more than $100 million under the Endangered Species Act trying to recover many of the same fish we were trying to poison out in 1962.
In the Green River.
In the Green River. So things go full circle.
It's rife with ironies. Let me just ask you a couple. Two are very obvious, and I wonder if people commented on them. One, if rainbow trout were such a robust, competitive, survival of the fittest type species, why didn't they just let the rainbow trout outcompete the chubs and so on
right.
over time? Social Darwinian battle.
Interesting question. They were worried about. They were worried that they wouldn't succeed, and that these reservoirs would be taken over by other fish that they didn't want, both native and non-native. But it's an interesting question.
And then the other thing is, you made it pretty clear it was a death zone from the massive amounts of rotenone that affected not only fish but potentially insect and amphibian life. What did the rainbow trout eat? In there?
So very little. In fact, they would refer to the fish for many years thereafter. The fish you caught out of there were referred to as snakes because there was so little to eat. So they would grow long and skinny. So you'd have these just the opposite of that fich that I showed at the beginning.
Right, the opposite of what you want to catch.
Yeah, exactly. So they were these long, skinny fish because there was nothing to eat. So they would refer to them as snakes. But over time, the aquatic invertebrates recolonized enough that they had some food. But of course, today we still mess around with that now. So for that reason, often when you stock trout, you also stock the food on top of them, right? And there's been interesting disasters that have come out of that as well with the mice and shrimp. But anyway, maybe that's too much to get into now. But it is a whole nother interesting, You start trying to engineer an ecosystem, and you push one button, and then you have to push more and more and more, right? Intervention begets more intervention and more intervention. Yeah.
Well, let's go on with your story.
Okay, I'll go on with my story.
I had to ask those two questions.
Okay, thank you. So now I'll skip forward to, again, another 30, 40 years to the present day. And the issue that really actually got me interested in this initially was controversy that's going on in California at the time in the Sierra Nevada. And they have the mountain yellow-legged frogs there, which are native to these. They've got 10,000 gorgeous lakes. There's a picture of one right there, just absolutely stunningly beautiful. But there were no fish in 95% of them. And consequently, this whole unique fauna evolved up there, including the mountain yellow-legged frog. But at the same time, so 100 years ago, people start going up there and they see these lakes devoid of fish and they think, what a waste. And this includes not just the miners who carried fish up there to some of these lakes in their backpacks, but also John Muir, he visited Livingston Stone at his hatchery and became a proponent of fish stocking. And so he was a proponent of stocking the Sierra Nevada with fish. So it's sort of interesting that sort of St. John Muir was also responsible for this. So they did this for quite a while with putting fish in cans on horses and mules and backpacks and carrying them up there. But it's not a very efficient way to. It's a lot of work just to stock one lake. So after World War II, we had a lot of demobilized pilots from the war and a lot of military surplus aircraft. And a couple of these guys in California, the picture on the top left, the man second from the right is Carroll Faced, who worked for California Fish and Game. And he was a bomber pilot in the Pacific during the war, came back, and with some peers, with one peer really, they decided we can do this so much more efficiently than hauling them up there on backpacks. We're going to drop them out of planes. So they do these experiments that I talked to him for a while, and he's put together a really interesting sort of notebook of memories of these days, and it's fascinating. The first thing they did was they just tried to see if they could actually drop fish out of a plane. They put the fish inside a milk can, flew the plane up over this pond, and chucked the whole milk can out the window. And they missed. And so the milk can goes bouncing along the rocks. And they go land and run over and look in the milk can, and there's still 16 fish alive in the milk can. And they say, well, shoot, if they can survive that, they can survive anything. But they do some more experiments. They hold, to see if fish can fly by themselves, they stick their hand out the window of the truck holding a fish up and gun it down the driveway as fast as they can, and then dunk the fish back in the water, and sure enough, the fish can survive. So they cut a hole in the bottom of that military surplus C-45 there and do a test. And they pour the fish out of the milk can, out the back of the plane, and big spray of water, and a lot of fish go flying down, and sure enough, the fish survive. And so within a few years, up until we intervened, 95% of the lakes in the Sierra Nevada had no fish. Within a few years, 95% of the lakes in the Sierra Nevada did have fish. And this isn't just the Sierra Nevada, of course. We do it in Colorado. This is an ongoing way of stocking fish. But then we get up to 2000, 2001, and at least, a few people, including this guy, Roland Knapp, who's on the left, began asking questions about this. And this controversy is one of the controversies that fascinated me and got me going in terms of how the science is used, because everybody had noticed that the mountain yellow-legged frogs were declining in these lakes. The question is, what was causing it? Well, the fishermen were sure, and they had the evidence to prove it, that it was pesticide drift from the Central Valley. And the agricultural folks in the Central Valley were sure, and they had the data to prove it, that it was the fish that were being stocked. So it was, everybody had their science to back up their side of the story. Well, so Roland Knapp decides to do an experiment, and so he goes up and they're not allowed to use rotenone anymore in California because of the toxicity issues that I mentioned. So they have to gill net out the fish out of a few of these lakes just as an experiment. And that's an intensive operation. That's a 3-year operation, stretching these gill nets throughout these lakes, checking them, they stay up all winter. Finally gets rid of all the fish, and sure enough, the frogs do make somewhat of a comeback. And so all of a sudden this controversy erupts about whether California Game and Fish is going to need to Fish and Game is going to need to start removing these fish from these lakes. And they, in fact, start talking about doing that. And they stopped stocking. A lot of their aerial stocking, they just halted altogether, because in addition to what he showed about their effect on frogs, he showed that many of these, much of the fish stocking was maybe unnecessary because these fish were naturally reproducing. And if you stock on top of that, you create stunting, and maybe not even maybe the fishery is better even if you don't keep this intensive stocking up. And California begins a comprehensive plan about how to manage these lakes. And as part of that, they talk about, and in fact start going about, removing fish from some of them. And this becomes controversial as well, because they don't really want to tell everybody exactly which lake they're going to remove the fish from, because the bucket brigade will be out, in a heartbeat. And these lakes are within half a mile of each other. It's very easy to catch some trout from one lake and bring them over and dump them back in. So they sort of don't want to announce this because they don't want the public to just go and it's an intensive effort getting rid of the fish. You don't want it to be ruined overnight. So it becomes this very controversial issue, and continues to be this very controversial issue in California. And then on top of that, to make it even more interesting, amphibians are declining worldwide because of a chytrid fungus that's killing them. And the mountain yellow-legged frog are being hit hard by this. But Roland Knapp makes this interesting point that, look, it's not just the frogs that are being affected by the fish stocking, it's the whole ecosystem that and in ways that we haven't even thought through. So there's this ripple effect that these fish, the biomass of aquatic invertebrates in a pond or a lake that has fish is 100 times less maybe than the biomass of aquatic invertebrates in a lake that doesn't have fish. And these are an important subsidy for these birds and proteins, because they, of course, hatch and come out of the lake and create this very important protein subsidy for the birds that are up there for the summer trying to raise their young, and the bats. And that's just beginning to be studied. And so it's an interesting and ongoing operation and controversy. How much time do I have left, do you think?
10 more minutes.
Okay, so I'll just skip to the last really fascinating problem as well that comes out of rainbow trout. And one of the major effects that they've had, rainbow trout are very closely related to the native trout of the Rocky Mountains, which are the cutthroat trout. So closely related that they can easily interbreed with them. And so, in fact, they've driven some subspecies of cutthroat trout to genetic extinction, which is to say you can't find any pure any pure individuals. And it's become a really interesting problem in the northern Rockies, for example, in Montana and Idaho, where you have the westslope cutthroat, which used to have the largest range of any cutthroat subspecies. But now, depending on who you talk to, that range has been dropped down to 20% or even 2% of what it used to be. And why the discrepancy in numbers? It depends on how you define a westslope cutthroat trout. So rainbows have been introduced all throughout the Rocky Mountains, and they have interbred and hybridized with these cutthroat. And then the hybrids continue to spawn and hybridize and hybridize and hybridize. So you get these sort of hybrid swarms that are moving everywhere. And that picture on the bottom right is from the North Fork of the Flathead in Montana. That's probably Glacier on the other side there, Glacier National Park. This picture, I'm sorry I don't have a legend up there, but the black dots are hybridized fish. Mm-hmm. The white dots are the only absolutely 100% pure remaining populations. And so the pure remaining, and this is from a paper by Christopher Hitt and others. Hopefully people can see that on the bottom if they're more interested. The only place you find 100% pure westslope cutthroats are in these extremely isolated high headwater streams, and the populations are so small in many cases that they're at risk of inbreeding depression. In addition, most likely, a lot of the genes that would have adapted these fish, these westslope cutthroats, for main stem conditions would be different than the conditions for the fish that are up there in these high headwater streams. And you're never going to find those genes again except in the hybrid populations, right? So we've got this conundrum where the hybrid fish are both the primary threat to westslope cutthroat because they're hybridizing with them, and yet at the same time they may be their only hope for salvation, to get rid of the inbreeding depression and maybe provide them with these genes for these main stem conditions again. So it's this really fascinating conundrum. I don't envy the folks that are trying to grapple with this one. And it raises this whole issue of what is a species under the Endangered Species Act. In fact, a group petitioned to get the westslope cutthroat listed as an endangered species, and that threw it into Fish and Wildlife Service's lap. And they had to decide what is a westslope cutthroat. If you say it has to be 100% pure westslope, no introgression with rainbow genes, then we're down to a very, very tiny population. Right. They probably ought to be listed. But if you're willing to accept a little bit of rainbow genetic material in your westslope cutthroat, then they're doing okay. If you're, and so the Fish and Wildlife Service decided, okay, anything less than 20% rainbow genes, we're going to count as a westslope cutthroat trout, and therefore we aren't going to list this thing. Yet the petitioners say, wait, that's not fair. And it raises this issue of what is a species and what is a hybrid. And, there's some evidence that these hybrid fish are less fit than the purebred fish in these conditions. But at the same time, I think, again, going back to values, clearly one of the reasons, why are we so obsessed with purity, with absolute pure fish? What is it about that? Are we willing to accept 1%, half a percent? What? It's this fascinating set of values that I think, and again, it's always argued in terms of the science, right, but the values also clearly are a major driver that need to be addressed.
Well, you've given us a great synopsis.
Yeah. So
that's a wonderful overview, and
I'll just there. I'm done.
Good. That's because I want to let people know who haven't had a chance to pick it up. It's a wonderful read. It really is. I mean, it asks very hard scientific questions about non-native species, hybridization, stuff we deal with today that they've been dealing with since the 1870s. But the stories are great too. Yeah. I'd forgotten the Green River story and did not know the West Slope story, and those are fascinating.
Yeah, it's a lot of fascinating issues.
Now, one other aspect you dealt with in here that ties into your concluding point about values and so on is the values anglers bring to the rainbow debate that kind of drives it. And is there a transition now where anglers are looking for non-rainbow trout, or is
I think there is, but I think it's still pretty small.
You also talked about how fishing kind of ebbed and and flowed over the age. Was fishing really popular right after the Civil War? Is that one of the spurs?
It became very popular. They had fish and game private fishing clubs all over the country, and it's fun to visit some of those old fishing clubs. But also, I think on an interesting note that I'll try to throw in here, it's a little off your question, but one of the justifications often for stocking fish is it creates a constituency for clean water, right? Yep. It gets people out fishing. It gets kids out fishing. It's the same thing that came from the 19th century. And I get this question a lot about, so should we be stocking or shouldn't we be stocking? And first I want to emphasize that the book isn't really a advocacy book in any way. It's just a story of maybe a parable that hopefully extends more broadly. And one of the things that I usually respond to, whether we should be stocking, one of the effects, on the one hand, if you take some fish and you stock them into a reservoir that's already completely modified, whatever habitat used to be there, it would seem like no big deal. But on the flip side, it sends a message, and I notice this with my kids a lot. They think fish come from hatcheries and snow comes from snow guns. And just as Marsh tried to create, it's a technological fix. And if people think the technological fix is always available, then they're not going to worry about what they do to the environment and to the habitat. And so, I mean, I even draw an extension to climate change, for example. That we are so inculcated with this notion that there's always a technological fix that we cease to worry about sort of addressing these issues holistically. So, and I guess that also brings me to this final note that one of the things that I really noticed when I was writing this book is that the rhetoric from the 19th century is so similar to the rhetoric from today. Yeah. They were sure they were doing the right thing, just as we're sure we're doing the right thing today. Even if it's restoring native fish, we're sure we're doing the right thing. And I guarantee you, in 100 years, they're going to be groaning about whatever it is that we're doing today. So.
That's a perfect endpoint too, because that's what historians do. This isn't a policy book by any stretch of the imagination. It's a thoughtful retelling of the story of a fish. And I think it's kind of interesting that we can actually tell histories via one species and illuminate a lot of human history, and that's what it does. It's a good read. There's tons of information, and the reader could draw their own judgments after reading this. I do have to ask you one last question, because I think people might wonder, did you get your love of fishing back after writing the book? I mean, after writing about rainbow trout and anglers and the growth of sport fishing and the post-Civil War era, did you want to get back out there?
Well, in two ways. I did, for sure.
And you got kids,
and
too. That'll draw you back in. Yeah.
Right. So one of them is I love fishing for native subspecies of trout. I'm from the West, so I love, because to find these native subspecies of cutthroat, now you get to go to these really remote, cool places. So I love doing that. It's like the birders and their life list. I have my life list of native trout that I've caught. But I also really enjoy catching rainbow trout now, like you say, because, especially hatchery rainbows, because they're so loaded with human history that you pick one up and you hold it, and you're holding sort of all the values that we have had, all the contradictory values we've had over the last 150 years. They're right there in that one fish. And so I sort of love looking at the fish that way.
It's a finned artifact.
That's right.
Well, Anders, thank you so much for coming out to NCTC. The book is called An Entirely Synthetic Fish, How Rainbow Trout Beguiled America and Overran the World. And I think just from this brief presentation, you made your case. They beguiled us, and they definitely overran 6/7 of the continents of the world.
That's right.
And you can get the book anywhere, and Anders will be giving a talk this evening at NCTC, and we really appreciate your time, and I appreciate all of you taking the time to tune in, and we'll see you again in a couple months.